Turning our attention now to the fallout of the British election, that emphatic result for Boris Johnson. One of the big issues now will be how the UK engages with the rest of the world, including, of course, Australia. I spoke to the British High Commissioner Vicki Treadell earlier this morning.
Well, the Prime Minister has achieved an 80-seat majority and a full new 5-year term. So everyone can really understand that we have political stability, a new government and a Prime Minister who's feeling confident, wanting to push ahead fast and at pace with the agenda ahead.
And in that context, we saw almost a relief rally with the pound surging off the back of the exit poll on election night.
Well, markets like certainty, and that's what they've got. They know that the British government is now in a strong position. Mr. Johnson has the parliamentary majority that he needs to push through his legislative programme and indeed the high ambition that he has for the country, both in terms of what he wants to do domestically to make sure that those who have felt left behind see the investment in infrastructure, see the investment in their communities, but also high ambition about Britain's place in the world. He is, after all, when he was Foreign Secretary, the man who coined the phrase Global Britain. Yeah,
so that's interesting. I do want to explore that in a moment, but before we get into the world view of Boris Johnson, I want to ask you about the result itself, because it seemed that Boris Johnson was able to win over the Labor leaver vote, those that wanted to leave the EU, but also retain the Tory Remainer vote. So was it a situation where you think even those that might have voted Remain a couple of years ago just wanted clarity once and for all, some end to the chaos?
I think you have to remember that a lot of people who voted Remain are also strong believers in democracy and respecting the outcome of a referendum. So even if many people felt that they had wanted to stay in the EU, they understood that the referendum was a decisive outcome for the Leave campaign. So respecting that and seeing that through as Democrats, if you like, was important to them too. And political stability, a clear mandate to break this deadlock. A lot of people, I think, thought about that deeply and decided, for the sake of our country and our future, what is the best way to vote?
Well, as you know, and you've pointed out, but obviously our viewers would be well aware as well, that the timeline now is by the end of January, Brexit will be delivered. And with that thumping majority, there's no doubt that's the case. What's the first priority post-January 31 for the British government in terms of engagement, that global Britain that you spoke about, the Boris Johnson broader worldview? What would be his first priority post-January 31?
Well, I think the first priority is to make sure on the domestic agenda that people believe he will deliver the promises for British citizens back home. So the NHS is a #1 priority to reassure people that it is safe under his government. That was a key election point. But in terms of outward-facing Britain and what we do internationally, a priority is to land some of those first free trade agreements that we need with the world in order to strengthen our economy and get the investment that we need into our country. Now,
and in that context, you would say Europe, ironically, as Brexit is delivered, one of the first priorities will be to re-engage on an FTA.
Absolutely, and I think that work will start already. Don't forget, we have the policy framework agreement that was part of the departure arrangement, and a lot of the groundwork setting out what a future FTA with Europe already exists. So picking that up, pursuing the negotiations with the EU, so that in the transition period we have, that takes us up to the end of the next calendar year, we put in place that future arrangement with the EU. But in parallel, an equal priority will be to pin down and consolidate the work that has been done to date on future FTAs with countries such as Australia.
And when it comes to an FTA with Australia, are we talking about negotiations launching almost immediately as of the Brexit being delivered, so early February? it would start?
I'm pretty certain, and I think my Prime Minister has made it very clear that an FTA with Australia is, quote, a top priority. I know that your Prime Minister and your Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, are equally keen to see it as a top priority.
But we already have enormous trade and investment between our two nations. We've spoken about that before.
Yes.
What more growth is there? Is there much upside?
Yes, of course there is. We want to open up sectors in both directions to do even more trade and to attract even more investment. Now, Britain may be the second largest investor in Australia. We want to keep that position. We want to consolidate that. We want to see more Australian investment into the UK. Some of your biggest property developers are very invested in the UK, people like Lendlease. I think this election outcome gives them some surety about the stability of the UK and their investments there. So we have a lot of work to do. There are lots of opportunities.
Would there be an opportunity as well for Australian personnel and British workers as well to be able to work in Australia or Britain without a visa?
That is a possibility, and I think, you know, the FTA negotiations will certainly look at immigration. We want easy business to be done between our two countries. Part of that is actually how the movement of people takes place between our two countries. But let's not forget what we've already achieved by improving the arrival experience for Australian travellers to the UK already, with the channel dedicated to Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Americans, Japanese, Singaporeans, using exactly the same channel as British citizens. That was hugely welcome. So we will build on things like that to make two-way flow of trade, investment and people the best that it can be. But that will be in the detail of the final negotiation.
And how soon would you like to see a deal done? Could it be done within a year?
That is the level of ambition on both sides. Our Trade Minister Liz Truss, when she was here talking to Simon Birmingham, they were both very clear that they wanted to achieve it as quickly as was possible, but without compromising a good deal.
And High Commissioner, when we reflect on Britain post-Brexit, it would be wrong to suggest this is Britain in a period of isolation. It's more about Britain now re-engaging with the rest of the world. I've already reported with you the British enhanced engagement with the Pacific, for example. That's just one example of where, I guess, the Foreign Office will be looking, where the Johnson government will be looking to re-engage elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we have to remember that Britain has always been globalist. It's always been out there. There has been a perception that we've retreated inward a bit. I need to dispel that myth. You know, over my career, which is a long one in the British Foreign Service, I have seen our activity worldwide. I've seen the sort of influence, support, help, being a good friend to many of our international partners in action. We have been slowly increasing our network, and certainly in the last 2 years, we've injected a lot of new resource into our global network, precisely to best position ourselves for the opportunities post-Brexit. Now that is reality. The 31st of January will be departure date. We now have 280 posts across 168 countries and territories. That makes us the largest European diplomatic network in the world. And we still have 1 or 2 more slots to consolidate. I've seen my own network here in Australia grow in my time here, 9 months now. So that is our level of ambition. Just last week, we saw our first ever resident High Commissioner to Samoa present his credentials to the head of state. A month ago, we opened our first mission to ASEAN, and our first ever ambassador to ASEAN presented his own credentials. When we talk about being really active in the Indo-Pacific, another example, opening our first ever resident High Commissioner ambassador to the Maldives. So this is Britain out there, growing our footprint, strengthening our existing teams and networks, because we want to trade more, we want to attract more investment, we want to work with close allies and partners like Australia on the foreign and security policy agenda, because this is about Britain being in the world, making a difference, being a strong ally and partner, and dealing with some of the biggest global challenges that we face.
British High Commissioner Vicki Treadell, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.